number that's not identified. The person who's 909-496-4733, could you please identify yourself?
Yes, it's Anthony Serrano.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Serrano. We will substitute your phone number. We'll put in your name instead of your phone number on the record so we know who you are. And then if you could go on mute, that would be great.
Okay, I'll do that now. Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like Ms. Dias, if you could go on mute as well, that would be good. We're getting a little feedback. All right. So, yeah. Mr. Serrano, I don't want to put you on mute because then you won't be able to unmute, but can you put yourself on mute? We haven't got, you're not showing us being on mute yet.
Okay, that's star 86, right? There we go.
Okay, I don't hear you. We'll leave it that way. For some reason, it's still not showing as mute, but unless there's feedback, we won't put you on mute. And it looks like, Mr. Petrozelli, do you want to say something, or are you just not going on mute right now?
I just took the mute off in case I have to object.
I think that's probably appropriate. Unless we have feedback, that's good. And we'll try to pause between questions and answers to give everyone a chance. All right, so with that, we're ready to go. We have, let's see, I've got to find them on my screen here. Mr. Eggers and Mr. Vasquez are here, and Ms. Stork is somewhere. There she is. Okay. All right, so Mr. Donlin, who's going to conduct the cross-examination for BlueTriton?
Well, Mr. Lilly, Mr. Sanders and Ms. McGuire will be cross-examining. We are planning on having Mr. Vasquez and Mr. Eggers' testimony separately. You had asked for only one attorney to prepare a cross-examination. We did that, not knowing that they would be on a single panel. So that's the way we've prepared our cross-examination.
And that's certainly fine. So who's conducting the cross-examination, Mr. Vasquez?
Mr. Sanders.
All right. And I assume, well, he went first this morning. Do you want to start with him this afternoon for cross-ex?
That makes sense to me, Mr. Lilly. Thank you.
All right. So, Mr. Sanders, you may begin with your cross-examination of Mr. Vasquez. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. Hi, Mr. Vasquez. My name is Chris Sanders. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Ellison, Schneider, Harrison, Donlin, and I'm here today representing BlueTriton brands in this proceeding. I'm setting a timer for myself so that to the extent that I can watch the time. I will be doing the cross-examination of your testimony, and my colleague, Ms. McGuire, will be doing the cross-examination of Mr. Eggers. I'm going to ask you numerous questions today based on your presentation, your testimony, and the report of investigation. Most of my questions will require you to respond yes or no. There is a court reporter here who is transcribing the record, so please be sure to provide a clear verbal response rather than nodding or shaking your head. I'm not here to trip you up. My goal is to get a better understanding of the prosecution team's position in the report of investigation and the draft CDO. I am hoping that we can complete this questioning within 45 minutes, but that's not very likely. There's a considerable amount of material to cover as a result of a 7-year investigation, and your testimony is critical to the state's case in chief in this matter.
All right, and just so we're clear for both Mr. Sanders and Mr. Vasquez, Ms. Mullen of my staff is very adept at putting up exhibits on the screen. So we will, if you're going to ask Mr. Vasquez questions about any of his exhibits, I presume it would be primarily PT7 and PT9, then please you can just say, will the staff please display, and we will display the appropriate exhibit, and then just tell us the page number or slide number. But I just think it helps us all to have the particular document on the screen when you're asking your questions, particularly because we're doing this virtually and not in person.
Understood. And some of them, if we need to, we can put them up, but a lot of them we won't need to. You know this material backwards and forwards, obviously, and you probably won't even need a citation to your testimony.
Yeah, and so Mr. Vasquez, that goes for you too. If you want an exhibit posted, just let us know.
I did have a question. I have my hand raised.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's not your fault. Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah,
Vasquez.
so I'm gonna be cross-examined individually, or am I able to defer to another witness on the panel?
Mr. Sanders will ask you questions. If you believe that one of the other members of the panel, either Ms. Stork or Mr. Eggers, is more qualified to answer the question, just please say so, and then Mr. Sanders can decide if he wants to have the other witness testify or if he wants to move on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Vasquez, your CV indicates you have a degree in chemical engineering. Is that correct?
Yes, for my bachelor's degree, yes,
And you are a licensed civil engineer. Is that correct?
correct.
And from approximately 2000 to 2012, with the exception of 1 year, you worked as either a water resource control engineer or a senior water resource control engineer
That is
with the
correct.
Regional Water Quality Control Board.
That is correct.
And would it be fair to say that your experience with the regional board was in water quality?
That is correct.
Okay. And prior to taking the position with the Division of Water Rights, did you have any professional experience with water rights?
I did not,
Okay,
not
thanks.
directly.
Okay. Are you a hydrologist?
I am a licensed civil engineer and a chemical engineer and an environmental engineer also.
So you're not a licensed hydrologist.
I am not.
Okay, that's fine. Are you a licensed hydrogeologist?
I am not.
Are you an attorney?
I am not.
Thank you. You directed the preparation of the ROI.
I did.
Is there any new information or evidence that you included in your testimony today that was not included or relied upon in the ROI?
I presented a diagram from an from an old agricultural engineering journal article.
And that's the only difference?
Can I pause to think?
Sure. We want accurate answers.
Yeah, I'd like to say that Mr. Eggers was a staff lead who drafted the 2021 ROI. He is also knowledgeable as to whether, there was additional information. So.
All right, Mr. Petrozelli, please try to limit your comments to specific objections. Your comment is noted, and Mr. Vasquez, you may answer the question if you have knowledge to do so.
Can Mr. Sanders repeat his question?
Sure. Is there any new information or evidence that you included in your testimony today that was not included or relied upon in the ROI?
I believe other than the old journal article diagram, no.
Thanks. Your testimony states that the 2017 ROI and the 2021 ROI are primarily the same. And in support of the Water Board's motion to quash, you indicated that the 2017 was copied into the 2021 ROI. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. What are the differences?
I'd like to refer to some handwritten notes I had jotted down.
Okay.
We decided, for clarity of terminology, that we will switch from using wells or horizontal wells. We decided to do an across the board change to use the term borehole instead of wells. We mostly rewrote the entire analysis about the pre-1914 water right that was identified in the 2017 ROI, and that's been revised substantially in the 2021 ROI because of new information that we were able to receive and analyze. There was the SUP was issued in 2018 by the Forest Service, and therefore we accounted for the elements of the SUP and the AMP studies in our ROI. I added, or there was an additional footnote about to point out the difference between how the term developed water was used in the 2017 and 2021 ROI compared to the Office of Enforcement November 2020 memorandum.
Okay, is that it?
That's what I can recall and what I was able to jot down.
Do you mind making sure you preserve those notes that you have in front of you?
Sure.
Thanks. Did BlueTriton Brands provide you all the information that you requested?
Could you clarify at what point?
Well, if you made a request, did BlueTriton ever not respond or provide a document in response?
I would say there was a response every time.
Okay, thank you. Why did it take 3.5 years to issue a revised ROI?
One factor would be that we had a change in staff, and that staff had to get up to speed and review many relevant documents. We also received many comments on the 2017 ROI, about 45 of which were unique comments that we had to look at and consider. There were other work that was being conducted in the division that I was also responsible for, and I could not. There were times when I had to focus my attention on certain activities of the division and could not spend all the time I needed to spend on the Nestle BlueTriton case.
Okay, and the response to comments were completed in January 2020, yet the ROI, the revised ROI wasn't published until April of 2021. Is that correct?
That is the date that we put on the response to comments cover page.
What do you mean that's the date you put on that cover page? Were those completed at that time?
Yes, they were.
Okay, so
well, that's that final, because when we put the date on there, that is the final date. I mean, I guess I'm alluding to were a draft of it submitted to me beforehand. Yes, I reviewed them, but it was finalized, or what we would call, finalized in January of 2020.
And was that document made available to anybody or posted on the board's website at any time prior to April of 2021?
No, it was not.
Thank you. In paragraph 31 of your testimony, you state that blue lines indicate natural stream channels on a topographic map. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we bring up PT9, please?
Okay, PT9 is Mr. Vasquez's summary slides.
That is correct.
All right, we'll post that.
And page 2, please.
All right, give us just one moment. All right, we have PT9, page 2 on the screen.
Okay,
Slide 2.
thank you. On this PowerPoint, you note the locations of the BTB diversions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And on this map, are any of the BTB diversions located on a blue line stream?
This map, I would like to point out this is not a topographic map, but I can see that the pink dots, some of them are on blue lines on this map.
Which ones are on blue line streams?
There is the lowest dot, I believe, is the springs 10, or are the boreholes associated with springs 10 through 12. The one closest to the yellow line.
Okay. And on page 10 of your presentation, you did not conclude that those boreholes were adjacent to a natural channel. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Can we go to page 10 of the presentation?
Please, Ms. Mullen, please put up page 10 of
Miss-
this PT9.
Mr.
you.
Lilly, I would appreciate if Mr. Petrozelli has an objection to please raise it.
I think what he did was raising an objection. So
Okay,
we have to do the best we can when we're all in different locations, but when in doubt, I'm always going to err on the side of asking for display of the matter, the exhibit page that's being referred to.
okay, fair enough. So is that correct that you did not conclude that the boreholes 10, 11, 12 are adjacent to a natural channel? Is that correct?
According to this chart that I presented, I indicated that it was unknown if it was adjacent to a natural channel.
Okay. Can we go back to page 2 of the exhibit that we just at?
All right, and I'm going to pause just very briefly here. Mr. Bilecki, you have your hand up. Is that on purpose or is that just a glitch? Do you want to say something?
That was accidental, excuse me.
All right, yeah. Please take your electronic hand down. Thank you. And we're back to PT9, page 2.
In your oral testimony, you testified that Coldwater Canyon is within the magenta area of the photo on page 2. Is that correct?
That's how I responded to Mr. Lilly. I would like to check myself on that.
So you did or did not testify that way?
I responded to Mr. Lilly that Coldwater Canyon was within the magenta outline.
And is that not correct?
I am unsure at this point, but I believe according to the map that Mr. Eggers presented, I would change my answer to no.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hop in and say that the Coldwater Creek
I'm
is the
sorry.
watershed to the east of the magenta outline watershed.
Mr. Eggers?
Better off answering that question as part of
Yeah,
the panel.
yeah, Mr. Sanders, I know this is a little free for all, but I think Mr. Eggers' brief comment to that effect is appropriate. And now we'll go back to Mr. Vasquez.
Okay. On page, can we bring up page 4 of your presentation, PT9? Okay, so on this, you indicate there's likely an appropriative groundwater claim to an unknown amount of percolating groundwater. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You also conclude that BTB has a pre-14 right to 7.26 acre feet per acre or acre feet per year. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you then conclude that a combined diversion that exceeds 7.26 acre feet per year is unauthorized. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But didn't you just say that BTB has an appropriative right to percolating groundwater?
I would like to look at my notes as to what was in my script about this, and there's actually more in the ROI about this third bullet point conclusion.
So you just indicated you have a script for your testimony. Can you maintain a copy of that as well?
Sure.
Thank you. But I guess my point is, if there is a right to percolating groundwater for an unknown amount, isn't it inaccurate to state that a combined diversion that exceeds 7.26 is unauthorized?
What I said in my presentation is that a combined diversion that of water that is within the permitting authority of the board that exceeds 7.26 acre feet is unauthorized. I tried to limit the wording on the slide itself, but we could probably check what the court reporter or what the recordings recorded as me saying about the third bullet point.
Okay, fair enough.
And there's more explanation in the ROI and in the cease and desist order.
Understood. In paragraph 4 of your testimony, you note that decision 1194 and water right order 9808 supports as support for the statement the Santa Ana River is fully appropriate. Is that correct?
Excuse me, Mr. Sanders, I'm trying to write notes. What document are you referring to now?
This is paragraph 4 of his testimony, and he notes decision 1194 and water right order 9808. And that's not necessarily the important point. And
again, I'm looking. You're talking PT 7, his written testimony.
7, paragraph 4.
Okay, paragraph 4.
Mr. Lilly, may we put that on the screen?
Yeah, it would help me if no one else.
It's not necessary to have it on the screen. My question is very simple. Does the state board's fully appropriated stream declaration apply to groundwater extractions in the Santa Ana River watershed? Okay,
Mr. Vasquez, let us know if you want us to put up PT 7. If it's just one question, we may not need to. Do you want us to or not?
I would like to see what Mr. Sanders is referring to specifically.
Okay, so Ms. Mullen, please put up PT 7, and it looks like page 3 would be where it is.
Yeah, and could Mr. Sanders also repeat his question now that we have that up?
Yeah, after it's up, we'll try to get this so we're all on the same page, so to speak. Yeah, this is even better, Ms. Mullen. If she can, I don't know if you can get, yeah, it looks like that's for, just get the top of that page on the screen. And I think if we need to, we can scroll back to the prior page. But now with that up there, Mr. Sanders, please repeat your question.
Sure. Does the fully appropriated stream declaration apply to groundwater extractions in the Santa Ana River watershed?
Vague.
I would.
The objection is over.
Vague.
The objection is overruled. You may answer to the extent of your knowledge, Mr. Vasquez.
I would like to, could I ask for a clarification as to what type of groundwater?
Percolating groundwater.
Okay, so restate the question, Mr. Sanders, with percolating groundwater in it. That'll make it clear for all of us.
Does the state board's fully appropriated stream declaration apply to percolating groundwater extractions in the Santa Ana River watershed?
My answer is no, but I may not be the most qualified person to answer what goes into a fully appropriate stream declaration.
Okay, so we'll note that you said no. That's fine. Paragraph 5 of your testimony notes the drought declarations in 2014 and 2021 respectively. Did the board ever assert that BTB or its predecessors violated those drought declarations?
No, it was the drought. No,
that's fine. No, that's fine. Thank you. And are you aware that Arrowhead Springs There were donations of water from Arrowhead Springs to communities that were affected by the drought?
I was not aware specifically of donations from Arrowhead, but I'm aware bottled water is very vital during drought responses and emergency responses.
Thanks. Who was your supervisor during the preparation of the 2021 ROI and the 2017 ROI?
My direct supervisor would be, let me think back a little bit. The investigation started in July. Well, we first got the complaints in April of 2015. My supervisor at that time was Ms. Kathy Moroka. We got a new supervisor in enforcement, I believe in January or February of 2019. So I had a new supervisor at that point. And then that supervisor left his position in March of, I'm sorry. I got a new supervisor in January or February of 2018. And that supervisor left his position in March of 2019. And I believe my current supervisor, that supervisor who started in January of 2018 was Mr. Kyle Oceandusco. And then I believe starting in July of 2019, Mr. Roberto Cervantes has been my supervisor.
Thanks. You indicated that a complaint was inadvertently admitted from the list of complaints in the 2017 ROI. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And was the same complaint inadvertently admitted in the 2021 ROI?
That is correct.
And that's okay. Your testimony states that the public comments were accepted on the 2017 ROI until February 9th.
I'd like to object to the continued questioning. It interrupted my witness. I believe he wanted to answer a question.
He answered the, I'm sorry.
Mr. Vasquez, did you have a follow-up or further response to the last question about the inadvertent admissions of the complaints from the two ROIs?
Only that complaint that had been left out was received, I believe, in September of 2017. And,
okay.
But we were not aware. I was not directly aware of that complaint until afterwards.
Maybe you better tell us after what?
Oh, after the April 2021 ROI was issued.
Okay. All right, Mr. Sanders, you may proceed. And if you want to ask some questions about another part of his testimony, we'll scroll to it.
Oh, we're okay for right now. Thank you. Did you accept public comments after February 9th, 2018?
I am uncertain about that. Maybe when Mr. Egg, you could pose that question to Mr. Eggers, because Mr. Eggers was the one who managed the comments that were received.
Okay.
But I believe most of them came in before February, or on or before February 9th, 2018. That is generally kind of a soft deadline also. We do this for many other complaints. And if somebody is running behind and they're a day or two late, maybe even a week, we will receive it or accept the complaint.
Mr. Lilly, I've had my hand up for quite some time. I just want to ask a clarifying question of the process Mr. Sanders is going through.
And excuse me, Ms. Murray, I'm sorry if I'm multitasking here, taking notes, looking at exhibits and the screen. So I'm sorry I didn't see your electronic hand, but
Totally
please
get it.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand that BlueTriton is choosing to ask questions of Mr. Vasquez right now, but I also understand that the entire panel is available for cross-examination, so that if Mr. Vasquez believes that Mr. Eggers is a better person to answer a question, he can defer to Mr. Eggers without Mr. Sanders interrupting him repeatedly and denying Mr. Vasquez that opportunity.
All right, I think that might be a mischaracterization of what just happened here. I
It
think,
was before, but I want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
okay, so let's try to get this.
Go
Wait,
ahead, Mr.
just a minute, Mr. Sanders. So what's happening here, as I'm hearing it, is Mr. Vasquez has some knowledge about some of these topics, but he's saying Mr. Eggers may have more. And that is perfectly appropriate for Mr. Vasquez to make that comment. And Mr. Vasquez, please don't speculate, just tell us what you know. And then if Mr. Sanders wants to follow up with Mr. Eggers, I was just actually going to say this before Ms. Murray raised her comment. If Mr. Sanders wants to ask Mr. Eggers to follow up, like right now about this topic, that's fine. He can shift over to Mr. Eggers and then back to Mr. Vasquez. But that's the best way to handle this. Please just tell us what you know. And if you think another member of the panel knows more, then please say so. And we'll go forward that way.
Understood.
Thank you for that clarification.
And please accept my apologies if I talked over somebody. I did not intend to cut anybody off. I want the record clear. And I apologize, Mr. Vasquez, if I cut you off.
Mr. Sanders, you are doing fine. We are all doing the best we can with this virtual format. So please go ahead with your questioning.
Did you rely upon public comments or information submitted by the public after the close of the public comment period? When you issued the 2021 ROI?
I'm trying to consider Mr. Lilly's advice. The comments we received indicated to me that there is compelling information that we should take another, we should continue this investigation.
So I'm sorry, did you answer that you did rely on documents received after the close of the public comment period?
Can you clarify if you're asking if we relied on every single document or on just some of them?
Just any of them.
We relied on maybe, I don't want to speculate because Mr. Eggers might be able to answer that better if we use most of them, some of them, but I know we use some of them.
Okay.
I don't know if we use all of them.
Thank you.
All right, so Mr. Sanders, if you want further clarification, now's the time to ask Mr. Eggers.
I'm okay. Thank you, Mr. Lilly.
Please proceed.
Mr. Vasquez, in order for me to understand your responses as we go into more technical stuff, I think it's a necessity to have a better understanding about terms. So I'm going to ask you some questions. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
He doesn't have any choice. You get to ask the question, so go ahead.
True. Okay. Do you agree that there is a definition of spring water for bottling purposes of the Food and Drug Administration that have nothing to do with water right permitting?
I agree that there is an FDA definition for spring water for bottling.
Okay. And that the issue of the definition for FDA purposes is not the questions that we're going to discuss today, that it relate to surface water permitting. Is that correct?
There's some, the FDA definition has some bearing.
How so?
Well, I believe if the definition says that spring water that's collected must travel the same course as water that would exit the spring. That informs us about the nature of what the FDA expects is coming out of the spring.
And does the state board rely on the FDA regulation in implementing its?
We don't.
Okay, water right permit. Thank you. With respect to water rights, what is the definition of a spring?
A spring is I believe it's in my testimony, if I could pull that up, because it's kind of a lengthy, longer definition.
So take a moment to look on your testimony and then tell us what page and paragraph number you want us to put on the screen.
And if Mr. Sanders is aware of where that is in Mr. Vasquez's testimony, perhaps he can point that out.
I actually don't. And I apologize.
I believe it's paragraph 30.
Paragraph.
I don't see it in paragraph 30.
Yeah, I don't.
Let's just let Mr. Vasquez just take your time here for a minute. I mean, take your time to see if you can find it.
I'd like to ask, am I able to refer to a digital copy so I can do a word search, or I'm going through my notes?
We don't have any easy way to do that here.
I guess I'm more interested in what's your general understanding of what is the definition of a spring?
Spring is water that surfaces from the ground, and it may pool up as a lake or a pond, or it may flow as a running stream after it surfaces.
Okay, so it's and I'll offer something. It's a surface expression of groundwater.
Objection, attorney is testifying.
No, I'm asking a question.
Wait, excuse me.
Sorry.
Mr. Petrozelli, your objection is overruled. Mr. Sanders is authorized to ask leading questions here.
Is a spring a surface expression of groundwater?
I'm going to object. I think that calls for a legal conclusion.
It certainly does, Ms. Murray, but Mr. Vasquez has demonstrated significant knowledge of California water rights law. This is the field he works in. Even though he's not an attorney, he obviously is knowledgeable. So to the extent he has knowledge, he may testify, obviously only to the extent of his knowledge, and our ultimate decision-making will rely on the law rather than Mr. Vasquez's testimony about his understanding of the law if there's a difference. So with that clarification, the objection is overruled. And Mr. Sanders, could you please just repeat the question for Mr. Vasquez?
Thank you.
Sure. Isn't a spring a surface expression of groundwater? And I guess maybe an easier way of asking the question is, does a spring have to surface to be called a spring?
And again, Mr. Vasquez, this is just Testify to your understanding and to the extent of your knowledge.
Is that a compound question? Perhaps Mr. Sanders can reframe his question so we know exactly what the question is.
I think he replaced the first question with the second one.
I did.
So just repeat the second question, please.
Does a spring require a surface expression? And it, so that it's, so sort of a clarifying that it cannot be considered a spring unless you have a surface expression.
All right, now it's compound.
Then
So just ask. Wait. Everybody
I'll
stop.
rephrase the question.
Let's start over. Ask one succinct question without any statements, please.
Must you have a surface expression to be considered a spring?
And I would like to register an objection that that's vague because it's unclear if he's calling for a scientific or a legal definition of spring
I'm
or the
asking,
FDA's definition.
The objection is
I would
overruled.
concur with that.
The objection is overruled. Mr. Vasquez, please answer to the extent of your knowledge.
A natural
Considered a
spring
dewatered
requires a
spring
surface
still a
expression.
spring?
Wait. Somebody else is talking. I really want everyone to give Mr. Vasquez an opportunity to answer that question.
A natural spring must have a surface expression.
thank you. Thank you. Is the term spring defined in either statute or regulation?
I don't believe it is.
Thank you. Can you define the term spring orifice?
A spring orifice is it's an outlet on the ground surface that that water is exiting from, or it's discharging from.
Okay. And you note in your written testimony on numerous occasions that the spring
Or would
orifice.
discharge from.
Wait. Somebody is talking.
That's me. This is Tomas Eggers.
Alright.
Like, do you mean that
Wait.
could discharge from when you talk about spring orifice?
Wait. Time out. Mr. Eggers, I don't want you to talk unless Mr. Vasquez says, I don't know, I need Mr. Eggers to clarify that, or I have limited knowledge. I would like Mr. Eggers can provide more information, but otherwise, I think you have to hold off. We have too many different people talking at one time. So please wait. And with that, Mr. Sanders, please just try again with your question. And Mr. Vasquez, if you think Mr. Eggers is more qualified than you to answer, just say so. And then Mr. Sanders can decide if he wants to ask Mr. Eggers the same question.
And for clarification, he may also defer to Ms. Stork.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Petrozelli. So Mr. Sanders asked the questions. Mr. Vasquez, respond either, here's the extent of my knowledge, or I think Ms. Eggers or Ms. Stork would be more qualified to answer that question. So with that, let's go forward. Mr. Sanders, please state the question.
I'm sorry, can I answer the question again then, or am I stuck with my answer?
No, go ahead. If you know the answer and don't need the question repeated, go ahead and give it. Mr. Vasquez, please go ahead.
As to the question of what is a spring orifice, I would like to defer to either Ms. Stork or Mr. Eggers if they have a more appropriate response.
Okay, so Mr. Sanders, do you want to follow up with Ms. Eggers or Ms. Stork, or do you want to move on?
Let's just move on.
All right.
You know, in your written testimony that that the spring orifices were obliterated at boreholes 1, 1A, and 8, and tunnels 2, 3, and 7. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What does it mean to obliterate a spring orifice?
To me, the word obliterate means to destroy or to erase. But the word obliterate was, that's basically quoted from hydrology reports that we received from BlueTriton.
I understand that it was included but I guess I'm asking what is your understanding of the word? So
Asked
my
and
underst-
answered. He said destroyed.
He can, objection is overruled. Please clarify if you have anything to clarify, Mr. Vasquez.
obliterate means to destroy or erase
so there's nothing left of the spring itself,
of the spring orifice.
of the spring orifice. Thank you. Mr. Lilly, I'm about 40 plus minutes into my cross-examination. And unfortunately, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface.
All right, so let's figure out what we're going to do here. I would like you to tell me what the other topics are that you would like to cover with your cross-examination, Mr. Vasquez.
And I have a question too. Have we been, I mean, I believe on my clock, I have roughly 42 minutes. Do we have a timing for, interjections and other questions?
Well, we have to give a little leeway
Yeah.
so the clock is not running, although I don't have an actual stopwatch here, but it's been about 40 minutes. But I am concerned about how much longer Mr. Sanders thinks he's going to need to go. And I'd like to know what topics you're planning to cover, Mr. Sanders, and your time estimates for each of those topics. I mean, Mr. Vasquez has been pretty forthcoming with his answers. I don't think the problem is that he's trying to delay or obstruct in any way. I think it's just a question of what you want to
And
cover.
I agree. It's just that, we're talking about a 7-year investigation.
I understand. Just
and-
tell me what
and
topics you want to cover.
Yeah, and so we are going to cover Water Code Section 1200, 1201, the applicability of subterranean stream analysis, which are going to be, relatively extensive. We're going to cover some questions potentially about. We're going to cover some impeachment evidence, and we are going to cover exactly what it is is his understanding of how these existing facilities operate as in how they currently exist and why they believe that they have permitting jurisdiction over these. So
I will object to the extension of time. We all got 45 minutes. Every party got 45 minutes. We all have to decide how to use our time wisely and which questions to prioritize. Should the respondent be allowed additional time for cross-examination, I would request that a specific amount of time is given. So, I mean, pick a number, and perhaps Mr. Sanders can tell us, how much time he thinks he needs. But we shouldn't just keep this open-ended. I mean, we all get 45 minutes. BlueTriton has only asked questions of, one witness. So,
All
I
right.
definitely object to, an extension of time here.
All right, Mr. Donlin, your hand is up. Normally I would just have Mr. Sanders respond to this. If you have something to say, please try to keep it short.
Well, Mr. Petrozelli made our point for us. We are the respondent here. We're the only party thus far that is cross-examined. So to say that we all have agreed to limit our time is irrelevant. The point is, BlueTriton's entitled to as much time as it needs to examine Mr. Vasquez and Mr. Eggers and Ms. Dork. They have lengthy testimony, and it's complicated, and it's going to take time to work through. Part of the reason we've taken this long is that we're getting objections from counsel for parties that don't even have witnesses in front of you.
All right.
And
Mr. Sanders, I think we've heard enough on this. Mr. Sanders, how much more time do you estimate you would like to take for your cross-examination of Mr. Vasquez.
Mr. Lilly, I apologize for this, but I am less than a quarter of the way through my cross-examined questions. And so I would anticipate at a minimum another hour and a half or more.
We object. That is ridiculous.
All right. Nothing more, please. Thank you. And just so we're clear on the record, Mr. Petrozelli, the hearing notice says parties will initially be allowed 45 minutes for cross-examination, and the hearing officer in his discretion may allow additional time. So that's what we're operating under. The question here is whether or not to allow additional time. So, Mr. Sanders, it's 2:00 now. I do understand that you have some other topics that you want to cover. I don't think, I disagree with Mr. Donlin that you have an open-ended right to do as much cross-examination as you want for as long as you want. I don't think there's any principle of due process that allows that. I think I am authorized to run an efficient hearing, and there are limitations, but I'm going to allow additional time. So at this point, you've listed as I wrote down, 4 topics: Water Code 1200 and 1201, application of subterranean stream analysis, impeachment evidence, and then what Mr. Vasquez's understanding is of the existing operations and the Water Board's permitting jurisdiction. Are those your 4 topics?
Yes, they are. Mr.
All right.
Lilly.
So at this point, I'm going to do this. I'm going to allow another 45 minutes. That'll get us to 2:55. That'll be about time for a break anyway. And we're going to see where we are. I do think, Mr. Sanders, you may have to try to move things along and perhaps not ask every single question on your list. I do not think you have an open-ended right to take as long as you want on this. But on the other hand, you are covering important topics, and I don't want to restrict you from efficiently covering appropriate topics.
And I say with all candor, we tried to keep it and not cover ground over and over again. We are trying to be as efficient as possible. It's just that this is a phenomenal amount of information. So I will do my best to speed it along.
All right, so let's proceed with your next topic and go forward. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Vasquez, do you know when any of the spring orifices were obliterated?
I'm sorry, do I know
When any of the spring orifices were obliterated?
based on information that we received from BlueTriton?
Objection, vague. Can we specify which springs or spring orifices Mr. Sanders is referring to?
All of them.
Objection is overruled. Mr. Vasquez can answer the question to the extent of his knowledge and be specific as to orifices as he knows. Go ahead, Mr. Vasquez.
So the question is, do I know?
The question is, when were the spring orifices obliterated?
I believe somewhere in 1931, 1932, prior to, I would say prior to the 1940s.
Okay.
But the year 1930, 1931 stands out.
Okay, thank you. The information you cited in your testimony came from the hydrodynamics group and the Dames and Moore report. Is that correct on those topics?
Correct.
Do you have any idea what the information the hydrodynamics or Dames and Moore did to prove that the spring orifices were obliterated or where they were located? Do you have any idea how they did that?
Can you is the question, how do I know that the springs were obliterated? How do I know that Dames and Moore and the hydrodynamics group knew that the springs were obliterated?
Correct. Did they cite to any additional information?
the reports stated, I believe it was only the hydrodynamics group reports that stated springs were obliterated or spring orifices were obliterated.
Okay, thank you. Did you attempt to locate the spring orifices when you did your site visit?
For some we did, such as the ones like spring tunnels 2 and 3, we were told were at the spring orifices. So those, since we saw spring tunnel 2 and we saw spring tunnel 3 from the air, so I would say we saw those locations.
Okay.
We saw spring tunnel 7.
Did you locate the spring orifices associated with each of the springs during your site investigation?
We did not, because we did not.
Okay, thank
I
you.
can specify which ones if you would like me to.
Sure.
I believe we did not see the spring, or okay, we did not see any spring orifices for the ones we were asserting, but jurisdiction over. But for boreholes, springs 1 and spring 8, we did not see those locations.
Okay, thank you. How do you independently know if the diversions are at the natural spring orifice?
When the hydrodynamics group reports indicated when a spring or a tunnel or a borehole was originally installed at a spring orifice.
So let me understand this. The only information you have is from another report. Are you able to independently verify that?
We did not. Or well, are you asking in the context of the investigation that we did, or is that a hypothetical question that can anyone verify?
Nope. I'm asking, well, I'm asking, how do you do it? How do you independently know if the diversion is from a natural spring orifice?
If the diversion is there already and we have information saying this is where the orifice was, we took that as the location of the spring orifice.
Okay, but isn't the location of the original spring orifice fundamental to your assessment of whether or not they generated surface flow in tributary ravines or tunnels? Or I'm sorry, tributary ravines or channels?
Yes.
Thank you. Does the state board contend that springs discharged flow at flow rates consistent with the collection volumes?
And again, Mr. Sanders, I think it's important for you to refer to him as the prosecution team rather than the state board, because the state board has the prosecution team, the hearing team, and the board members, and all he can testify to is what the prosecution team contends. So please restate your question with that in mind.
Does the prosecution team contend that the state board, or does sorry, my apologies. Does the prosecution team contend that the springs discharged flow at rates consistent with the collected volumes?
We do not assert that.
Okay. Do you have any information to demonstrate what the natural flow is?
We have no information in this highly modified watershed.
But yet you contend that the flow would have naturally discharged at a volume sufficient to reach a surface stream or channel. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And does the prosecution team offer any evidence to demonstrate this?
I believe Ms. Stork is the most appropriate person to answer that question.
We'll come back to that one. Let's see. I'm trying to be as efficient as possible, Mr. Lilly.
That's fine. Please proceed.
Is it your understanding and testimony that springs developed through an orifice collect all of the spring flow from the orifice?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Is it your understanding and testimony that springs develop through all of the spring flow from the orifice?
Can Mr. Sanders repeat the question? He cut out.
Yeah, Mr. Sanders, there was just a breakup. Not your fault, but just try one more time.
Sure. Is it your understanding and testimony that springs developed through an orifice collect all of the spring flow from the orifice?
Vague. Whose testimony? I object again.
Overruled. Go ahead.
It is hard to know if it's, as I said in my oral presentation, the flows that can be measured now could be greater than or lesser than the flows of the natural unmodified spring.
Is the flow collected different depending upon the depth of the sanitary seal?
Objection calls for hypothetical.
Overruled. He can answer if he knows. Otherwise, he can say he doesn't know.
It depends on the length of the screened interval. But if the question is, does it depend on the length of the sanitary seal? No.
But isn't the screened interval dependent on the length of the sanitary seal and the overall length of the well?
The location of the screened interval, yes, comes after the sanitary seal.
Okay, so I guess my question though is the flow different depending upon the depth of that sanitary seal?
Again, calls for hypothetical.
I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Sanders, it's an incomplete hypothetical because you're asking him about how the length of the sanitary seal affects the yield or discharge through the borehole pipe. But I think he's also testified the length of the perforated interval also is relevant. So to just ask about the length of the seal without talking about the length of the perforated interval makes it an incomplete hypothetical.
And it's also important that, Ms. Stork authored many of the technical sections in the report. She is a geologist in the team. She is most qualified to answer many of these technical questions about geology and hydrogeology.
Right. So, Mr. Petrozelli, Mr. Vasquez has testified to this. Mr. Sanders may ask him, but as I've said before, Mr. Vasquez, at any time, if you don't have knowledge to answer these questions and you believe Ms. Stork does, you can just say that. All right, Mr. Sanders, go ahead. Mr. Sanders, please go ahead.
Mr. Vasquez was speaking.
No, I said I understand Mr. Lilly's direction.
Okay. Is the flow collected in a borehole or tunnel different depending upon the depth of the borehole or tunnel?
There's a lot of factors to consider. I can't speculate.
Okay. Is the point of diversion the point at which water enters the collection facility?
Hey, can Mr. Sanders better define what he means by collection facility?
I'm going to sustain that objection. I think, Mr. Sanders, you do need to clarify both what you mean by point of diversion, whether you're talking about a legal term or an engineering term, and second, what you are referring to by collection facility. So please restate your question.
Okay, so a typical borehole is drilled into the side of the hill, correct?
Correct.
And the first, in our case, most of the BlueTriton sanitary seals are in excess of 100 feet. So the first 100 feet is sanitary seal, is that correct? Or the first certain amount of distance is a sanitary seal, is that correct?
What I can tell from the well logs is the screened intervals were started for many of these boreholes. The screened intervals started after there was like a clay formation that was recorded in the well logs. And that clay formation to me is the fault gouge.
Okay. But assuming a standard well, which, and I'm gonna, I guess in BTB's case, isn't it perforated the entirety of the length of the borehole after the sanitary seal?
I believe that's correct.
Hey, can Mr. Sanders specify which boreholes he's talking about?
I think his question was for all of them, and I think Mr. Vasquez is your answer for all of them to the extent of your knowledge.
And I can answer quickly, or we can look at the well logs where they're indicated in the well logs in the Dames and Moore report.
I'm asking if that your general understanding is that's the case.
My recollection is that once a screened interval was started, there was not another section that was not screened.
Okay, thank you. And so my question about the point of diversion, so the point of diversion is when that water gets into the borehole inside the perforated pipe. Is that correct?
The point of diversion would be on the surface. If we were to map a point of diversion like we do for every other water right or statement, it would be at the surface where we are told this is where this borehole is started.
But that's not where the water is diverted, correct?
I'm Mr. Sanders, I think I'm going to have to ask you to rephrase the question. He has told you what his understanding of point of diversion is from the water rights enforcement point of view. Now, I think by using the term diverted, you're being confusing here. You might want to clarify that question with some other terminology.
As an appropriator of water, do you appropriate once it comes into your collection system?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
Okay, it's
Also
certainly
object that, again, Mr. Sanders is being vague as to what he means by a collection system.
The collection, go ahead, sorry.
The question is very general. It definitely calls for a legal conclusion. Mr. Vasquez, if you have knowledge to answer, you may. If you don't, you may say, I don't know. It's beyond my area of expertise.
And
I'm sorry, could Mr. Sanders restate the question one more time so I can decide if it's a question I can answer or not?
Sure.
Go ahead, repeat the
Is-
question,
is-
Mr. Sanders.
the
And to
point-
clarify, again, Mr. Vasquez may refer these questions to the expertise of his other panel witnesses.
And we've said that before, and that certainly is still the case. So with that, Mr. Sanders, please restate your question.
Is the point of diversion the point at which water enters into the borehole?
Mr. Sanders, please clarify as to at what point, what part of, what does he mean by the borehole? What part of the borehole?
The borehole, as we've defined it for this purpose, is the pipe with perforations. So I'll rephrase my question. Is the point of diversion the point at which the water enters through the perforated pipe into the collection facility?
No, the point of diversion is where we would map it, which is on the surface.
Okay. Does the State Water Board have permitting jurisdiction over percolating groundwater?
It does not.
And what provision of the water
Oh,
code?
well, I'm sorry, permitting, the question
Permitting
was
jurisdiction.
permitting jurisdiction. No, it does not.
And what provision of the water code gives the State Board the authority over the appropriation of water?
I believe it's 1200 and 1201, maybe even 1202.
And does Water Code Section 1200 expressly state that it refers only to surface water?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
No, I'm asking a question as to what the statute applies
Again,
to.
the statute speaks for itself and reads for itself.
Okay,
And if we want to
The
know what the
objection
statute
is-
says, we can put it on the screen.
the objection is sustained. Mr. Sanders, you may ask Mr. Vasquez what his understanding is of the statute, but Mr. Petrozelli is right. We can all read the statute
Okay.
and see what it says.
Mr. Vasquez, is it your understanding that the statute only applies to surface water and to subterranean streams flowing through known and definite channels?
I agree.
Is there a presumption within California law that diversions from beneath the ground are presumed to divert percolating groundwater?
Objection calls for legal conclusion.
Okay, let's not keep making those objections. And you can have a continuing objection to that. As I've said before, these are definitely questions that are asking for legal conclusions. I agree, but Mr. Vasquez has testified about the prosecution team's understanding of these provisions of California law. So it is appropriate for Mr. Sanders to ask him questions about that. And again, with the understanding, his answers are simply his understanding of California law, which may or may not be accurate.
And to the extent this is contained in Mr. Vasquez's written testimony, we would all appreciate it if Mr. Sanders would direct us to those portions of his written testimony that he is asking about.
Yeah, so far he's not asking a question about specific testimony, but if he does, we will ask our staff to put it up on the screen. All right, so go ahead, Mr. Sanders.
Well, let me ask the question. Was Water Code Section 1200 or 1201 mentioned within the report of investigation?
Objection. The report of investigation speaks for itself. We can word search the report of investigation for Water Code Section 1200 and 1201 in Division 2.
Okay, the objection is overruled. I think this is an appropriate foundational question for Mr. Sanders to ask Mr. Vasquez.
I don't believe it's in the report of investigation body, but it's contained in attached Office of Enforcement memos.
Did you mention Water Code Section 1200 or 1201 within your testimony?
I did not.
Are all of BTB's diversions from beneath the ground?
Wait a second. Again, I'm sorry if I have to clarify. I think Ms. Murray was going to object. I'm going to get to it first. I think you're perhaps misstating his prior testimony about what you mean by diversions and point of diversion. He's already testified the point of diversion is on the surface. He's already explained that the groundwater flows into the pipes through the perforated intervals. So I'm not quite sure what the point of your question is. I think we all know the facts here. Do you have something further that you want to pursue on this?
No, I'm fine, Mr. Lilly, thanks.
You may proceed.
Does the state board contend that, or does the prosecution team contend that BlueTriton is diverting from a subterranean stream?
We do not.
In paragraph 6 of your testimony, you indicate that you provided information on BTB water diversions to staff of Office of Public Affairs. Is that correct?
Can I?
Yeah, let's put up.
We can
Give us the page and paragraph number and we'll put it up.
Paragraph 6, PT 7.
Okay, so this will be on page 3, I believe, is where paragraph 6 starts. So we'll scroll down to paragraph 6, and then Mr. Sanders, tell us where in paragraph 6 you want to ask your question.
I think paragraph 6 continues on to page 4.
It does.
Yeah.
So at the bottom of that page right there, the last sentence or last full sentence, I help provide information on the matter to staff of Office of Public Affairs so they could respond to media inquiries.
Yes.
Is that, so that was in your testimony, correct?
Correct.
And who did you work with in providing this information?
With the Office of Public Affairs or specific staff in the Office of Public Affairs?
And any others that directed you to assist with this effort?
At the time, it would have been my supervisor, Kathy Maroka, our branch assistant, Deputy Director, John O'Hagan. I am pretty sure I asked Ms. Stork also for assistance in gathering information such as the groundwater recordations or any record we might have. Then specifically at the Office of Public Affairs, I can't remember. I can't remember the specific person there. There were only 2 or 3 staff at the time at the Office of Public Affairs.
Did Barbara Evoy, the Deputy Director of Water Rights, have any involvement with this preparation?
No. I don't recall that she did.
Has anyone at the board concluded that BTB's diversions were from percolating groundwater?
Egg, who does he mean by the board and who does he mean by anybody?
I'm asking, is he aware of anybody that he's aware of?
And the objection is overruled. Again, Mr. Vasquez, you can answer the question to the extent of your knowledge.
And perhaps Mr. Sanders can also specify as to which diversions. Does he specifically mean the diversions at issue in this cease and desist order proceeding?
Okay, that's probably a pretty important. I will sustain that objection. So Mr. Sanders, why don't you restate the question with that clarification?
Has anyone at the board concluded that BTB's diversions within Strawberry Canyon were from percolating groundwater?
Clarification, do you mean like up to and including the 2021 ROI and draft cease and desist order?
At any time.
I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself here in my head. Has anyone at the board, what can you restate the question?
Has anyone at the board concluded that BTB's diversions within Strawberry Canyon were percolating groundwater?
We, based on limited information at the Spring 7 complex and at the Spring 10, 11, and 12 lower complex, we concluded that there is a possibility that those diversions are of percolating groundwater, but we need more information.
But not from any other sources?
No. From spring tunnels 2 and 3 and 7 and boreholes 1, 1A, and 8, we concluded that those are not percolating groundwater sources.
I'd like to put up on the board or put up on the screen what has been marked for identification as BTB 23 that we submitted this afternoon.
Okay, this would be one of the, I don't know what we call them,
The prosecution
cross-examination.
team, the prosecution team is going to object to the introduction of surprise impeachment testimony. Again, the board regulations specifically state that it is the policy of the board to discourage surprise testimony and evidence. It does not distinguish between impeachment evidence and and case in chief evidence. It says evidence and testimony. Again, the respondent had an opportunity to submit exhibits, including exhibits that could be used for impeachment with its case in chief. And should it choose to impeach later, it can do so as part of its rebuttal. And that's how the board and board hearing officers have approached this type of evidence in every board hearing I've ever been in.
All right, the objection is overruled. There is a board regulation. It's Title 23 of California Code of Regulations, Section 648.4, Subdivision A, which states it is the policy of the state and regional boards to discourage introduction of surprise testimony and exhibits. I read that to mean for cases in chief. I think this is surprise cross-examination, which is the normal way a cross-examination is done. So I don't think that provision applies here. So we'll put up on the screen exhibit BTB 23. And now, Mr. Petrozelli, you may still have other objections to the questions, but I'm not going to I'm going to overrule the objection on the grounds that it's surprise testimony. So let's, Ms. Mullen, if you can put up BTB 23, we'll go from there. Okay.
So you can, if you need to take a moment to review this email, please do so. Because I'm going to ask you whether you're familiar with this document, since you are included on the email thread.
And in Mr. Sanders' questions about anybody from the board, may he specify as to whether he means the board in the sense of an official act, that is an order or decision adopted in a public hearing, or whether he means board staff?
I think, Mr. Sanders, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood your question to mean anybody within the board organization, whether it's a board member or a board staff member. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, Mr. Lilly.
Well, it's an important distinction, Mr. Lilly, because only board orders and decisions adopted in public proceedings are considered precedential. If
Okay,
you
well,
want the
he's
decision and the government code section, I can check those references for you.
He's just asking for Mr. Vasquez's knowledge. And frankly, I'm reading this for the first time now as well. I don't see Mr. Vasquez listed on this at all, unless I'm missing something. So I don't know whether he has any knowledge of this email at all to begin with.
If we scroll down,
Oh, okay. I hadn't seen this part. Okay. So do you want to scroll down? Maybe you better tell us.
I see my name.
All right. Do you want to scroll down further? Miss Mullen, please scroll down further. It's hard with emails because they go in opposite order. Okay. So now just scroll up so we can tell who wrote this email. Whoops. It's going to be a little hard to do this.
Yeah, and I apologize.
Okay. Well, here I do see an email that's from Mr. Vasquez to Mr. O'Hagan at the bottom of this page that we are now looking at. And it says starts out, the Nestle water bottling controversy deals with 3 bottling plants with water sources covered under different basis of right scenarios. Now, Ms. Mullins, if you can scroll down a little. And then there's a fairly detailed discussion here. So,
Mr. Lilly,
Mr.
can we blow this up? This is my first time seeing this. I'm only just downloading the exhibits.
I'll tell you what we're going to.
It would
That's
help
fair.
if it were a little bigger.
So this is what we're going to do. Mr. Sanders, how many of these exhibits are you going to ask questions to Mr. Vasquez about?
About, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 documents.
And what are the exhibit numbers?
They are, I apologize. Actually, maybe 12. They are BTB 23, 24, 27, 28, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, and 37. Actually, that's 13.
All right, I wrote down 23, 24, 27, 28, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, and 37. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, this is going to take us forever if we do it this way. So this is what I'm going to do. My understanding, I haven't double checked, but Mr. Anderson, can you just go off mute and tell me, have we in fact posted these to the AHO FTP folder and the BlueTriton exhibit folder?
They have been posted.
All right. So this is what we're
And
going
which
to do.
exhibit is this? Oh, 23. I see it.
Okay. And frankly, you can look at all the new ones. So it's going to be a little tricky for those of you who don't have printers, but we're going to take a 20-minute break so everybody who can print these exhibits so we don't have to keep scrolling back and forth with them, and so that Mr. Vasquez can have an opportunity to review them. So
Specifically, which exhibits are we going to look at again?
the ones he looked at were BTB 23, 24, 27, 28, and 30 through 37. So, Mr. Vasquez, do you have a place where you can print these? I don't think any of them, are any of these very long, Mr. Sanders?
No, most of them aren't particularly long. Some of them
All right,
are
that's fine.
emails.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And so let's print them. We can all print them, those of us who have access, we can look at them. And then let's reconvene at 3:15 and we will talk about it.
May the witnesses receive copies of these?
Okay, they're all on the board, on the AHO FTP folder now, where all other exhibits have been posted. So you should be able to download them from there. And if necessary, you can email them to Mr. Vasquez. So we're going to come back at 3:15. That'll be 25 minutes. If we need more time, we'll talk about it then.
And Mr. Sanders, is there supposed to be a 25 and 26?
That's it.
There is not.
Okay. I just want to be sure I got.
Good question.
Did someone email those to me as well? I've never downloaded from the FTP site.
Okay.
Yeah, that's Mr. Petrozelli, or Mr. Prager. One of you should get those to Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork as well. All right. So don't log off, but you can all turn off your cameras and your microphones. We'll be back at 3:15 and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
Okay, let's just wait one moment here and then we'll get started. I'm just finishing printing these exhibits, so I've got them all. It took a little longer than I thought. All right. It looks like people are beginning to gather back here. We're back on the record. So I have now at least downloaded and briefly reviewed these new exhibits that BlueTriton submitted or uploaded to our FTP folder at noon today, and that we've been posted to the BlueTriton exhibit folder. And I'm just going to ask, just primarily from a time management point of view, Mr. Sanders. Well, first of all, I don't think there's any dispute that these are all exhibits from the Water Board files. Is it correct that you obtained them from the Water Board's files?
You're correct, Mr. Lilly. We did BlueTriton did a Public Records Act request, and these documents were submitted in response to that request.
Okay, so I don't think there's any question about the authenticity or about the fact that the people who are listed as having sent the emails, in fact, sent the emails. So with that, and I have to say, after reading them, I'm beginning to think Mr. Petrozelli may have had a stronger point than I appreciated before I saw the exhibits, that a lot of these sure look like rebuttal exhibits. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them have either email passages or other text that was authored by Mr. Vasquez. So I think certainly, Mr. Sanders, you can offer them into evidence. I mean, normally that would be during rebuttal, but since they're here, I think they can be offered into evidence, and then you can, in your closing brief, make whatever arguments you want about the fact that different members of looks like Chair Marcus and various members of the Water Board staff made these various statements that are in these documents over the past decades. So you can do that. So my question for you to begin with is, what do you plan to ask Mr. Vasquez about this? I mean, I could see this either taking 5 minutes or 5 hours, and I just don't see that there's a lot. I mean, you can ask him if he wrote these emails, and I assume he'll say yes. But beyond that, what is it you want to ask him about these documents?
Well, what we are doing with these documents is demonstrating that the board has taken inconsistent positions. They previously had concluded that this was in fact all percolating groundwater and not subject to state water board permitting jurisdiction. And that the board has then deviated from that position for unknown reasons. So that's objective. The other documents that we are going to put into evidence are the historical practice of the Water Board that are absolutely inconsistent with the testimony of Mr. Vasquez as to how the board approaches spring water diversions.
And I'm not clear on that. Are both these types of documents in this group of exhibits you've submitted?
They are, Mr. Lilly.
Okay. So,
If the board is willing to stipulate that that this is the standard pattern and practice of the board historically, we can get those in. If the board is willing to stipulate that this is in fact they've changed position, we're willing to do that as well and avoid a lot of time and effort in getting these documents in.
Okay. Well, first of all, don't worry, Mr. Petrozelli. I will get to you. And Ms. Doty, I will get to you too. Let me just try a little bit here first to clarify. First of all, Mr. Sanders, you're being a little free and loose here with the board. And this is a mistake a lot of people make. The board is the 5 board members. They act by majority vote and they take certain actions. There are about 2,500 people on the staff of the State Water Board and the 9 regional water quality control boards who carry out their duties. I'm one of them. The other people here are others, and we all have very different duties and so forth. I think it certainly is perfectly appropriate for these, and again, I'll ask Mr. Petrozelli for his comments before I make a final ruling. But I think it's perfectly appropriate to admit these documents into evidence as statements that the given members of, in all cases except for Ms. Marcus, this is members of Water Board staff. There are a few short statements from Ms. Marcus when she was the chair of the board. So I think it's perfectly appropriate to enter into evidence that these staff members made these statements on these dates. And then you can argue from that in your closing brief, or that's appropriate if we have other argument times, as to the meaning of that and as to whether staff position has changed and whether the board, if it adopts a final order, should follow these prior staff positions or not. So I think you can do that. That's a little different. I don't think it's appropriate to ask Mr. Petrozelli to stipulate to the content or the spin of these, but I think it is appropriate to just get an agreement that these documents were prepared by these staff members on these dates and state what they state. So if we do that, what more is there? And again, I haven't asked Mr. Petrozelli whether he agrees or not yet, but if he does agree to that and we put them into evidence that way, do you have anything further that you need to ask Mr. Vasquez?
Yes.
And what else would you ask about these documents? I mean,
about those documents. Well, so there's, the sort of 2 different distinctions of this document. One are the current position that has been taken by the board in the BlueTriton hearing. And then the other set of documents are the historical pattern and practice of the board as to how they addressed spring water diversions. And so they're 2 completely separate sets of documents for different purposes.
Okay. And again, those are both board staff positions.
They are.
And you can make those arguments. You can say this is inconsistent and that the board should consider these, whatever inconsistencies you claim are there, and the board should consider those when it decides what to do. So I think that's all fine, but I'm not seeing that there's any need to ask Mr. Vasquez questions. I mean, I think it's undisputed that he wrote what he wrote, and you can make whatever argument you want based on that. But what additional questions do you need to ask him during the hearing about these documents today?
About the emails, we don't have any additional any questions that we need to ask. With regard to the other memos and letters that are from the board. There are a few questions that we would like to ask about how consistent it is with the diversion facilities of BlueTriton. Why the board has deviated from, from what they have done historically, but it's primarily to demonstrate that the board, the prosecution staff, and the enforcement staff have not been consistent with either the statute or historical practice.
Okay, well, those are certainly two very different things here. All right, so I'm not hearing a lot of that you have a lot of what I would call relevant questions for Mr. Vasquez. I mean, the prior documents say what they say. You can argue whether they're consistent or inconsistent with current position. The only narrow area I can see where questioning of Mr. Vasquez is appropriate regarding these documents is if he has some explanation for what he has done in the context of these documents. That's all I'm hearing so far that seems relevant. I'm not sure how relevant his explanation is anyway, because at the end of the day, it's what my office and the board, the 5 board members, decide to do that matters, regardless of exactly what his position is. But I think potentially you may have some relevant questioning of how he developed his positioning, but that's all I'm hearing so far. Do you think there's more regarding these documents that's appropriate for you to ask Mr. Vasquez?
I have to say I don't believe so, but I would ask, if any of my colleagues believe differently, that they could certainly chime in right now.
All right, so Mr. Donlin, your hand's up. We'll go to you next.
Well, your point about these documents being official records of the State Water Board is well taken, Mr. Lilly.
Wait. And just so we're clear, I never said that. I said these are documents from the files of the Water Board. Official records has a different legal connotation, so please don't put words in my mouth. These are accurate copies of documents from the Water Board's files. I think we all agree on that. So go ahead.
Well, if these documents are deemed to be official records of the State Water Board pursuant to the regulation that you cited to us this morning, and we are able to get them into the record on that basis, I think we can move on. I know Mr. Sanders has questions of Mr. Vasquez that relate to the issues in these letters, but I think we could probably move on. Our concern is that how we get this in as evidence in this proceeding. If we don't have a witness that's relying on these documents, there may not be other means to get these historical records into the record other than you're agreeing that you can take official notice of them. So that's the dilemma that we find ourselves in right now.
All right. I think, again, official records is not the word I use. The regulation refers to official notice. I think we can take official notice of the fact that these documents are in the Water Board files. Now, and I think that's as far as we can go, but I don't know that you're going to be able to go much beyond that. I mean, you certainly can make legal arguments based on them, and I'm sure you will, but I'm not sure beyond that there's much more to do. But anyway, let's go to Mr. Petrozelli. What are your comments on this? I see your hand is up.
Oh my God.
Well, you got to be a little more specific.
That's a reaction, not just a comment. So first of all, can we get a time check as to, we said we would stop at 10:55 before we took a break. So it'd be helpful if we had a time check as to how much time BlueTriton had, and given what seems to be the remaining scope of their cross-examination, whether or not it's worth proceeding with that. Second, I agree that most, if not all of this is suitable for rebuttal, more appropriate for rebuttal, and should be treated in rebuttal. You know, as you said, these are from the files of the Water Board. They say what they say. If BlueTriton wants to use any of these for impeachment, they need to lay a foundation as to why the document they want to use is relevant for impeachment. And, you know, the witnesses are testifying as a panel. It's impeachment of the panel. And, you know, when the witnesses try to refer to their fellow panel witnesses, it would be useful if we would allow the other panel members to answer the question. We're essentially cutting them off. Many of these documents do not involve the springs at issue in this proceeding. With regard to many of these documents, the witnesses, I don't see where they were at all involved directly or tangentially with any of these. So again, if they're going to be used for impeachment, we need a foundation as to why the document that is being used for impeachment is relevant and suitable for impeachment. Finally, I would ask as to the persuasive weight of any of these, given that they are not orders or decisions of the State Water Board adopted in a public hearing. That is the pattern and practice of the State Water Board. Orders and decisions adopted in a public hearing. I believe that's in the Lagunitas decision. I can get the order or decision number. I can check the reference.
You can save that for your closing brief,
Thank you.
Mr. Petrozelli. I think that last argument goes to the weight the amount of weight that I should give these documents in my decision-making process. And I certainly understand the distinction between a board adopted decision or order and a staff statement. And I think everybody here understands that distinction. So here's what I'm going to do. And I agree, potentially they should have come in as rebuttal, but we have some flexibility with how we run the hearing. They're here now. I'm going to admit these exhibits into evidence. And again, it's with the understanding that these are in fact accurate copies of documents from the Water Board's files, and that the people who are listed as the authors of the emails and letter, in fact, sent the emails or wrote and signed and sent the letters. That's it. They're admitted for that purpose. And with that understanding, both of you, Mr. Sanders and company, and Mr. Petrozelli, can make whatever legal arguments you want based on these, with the understanding that these are in fact staff statements and not board orders, and we can go forward. So with that, Mr. Sanders, I don't think there's much need for additional questions about these documents of Mr. Vasquez, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to make an offer of proof if you think there are questions that are appropriate for you to ask him about these documents.
I think we're okay with your ruling, Mr. Lilly. I think we accept the limitations of what these documents were submitted for. And I don't need to ask any additional questions directly of Mr. Vasquez.
All right. So Mr. Petrozelli, your hand is up. Do you have something further to say on this?
No, I was going to ask for a time check as to how much time respondent would have for additional questions, but if Mr. Sanders and BlueTriton is done, then we can move on.
All right. So my notes were before Mr. Sanders said he was going to talk about water code, or ask Mr. Vasquez, questions about the water code sections 1200 and 1201. He's done that. Applicability of the subterranean stream out analysis, he's done that. Impeachment evidence, we've taken care of. So by my notes, Mr. Sanders, the only topic you have left for questioning of Mr. Vasquez is his understanding of how the existing facilities operate and his understanding of this, I think you said, of the State Water Board's water right permitting jurisdiction. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr.
So
Lilly.
what's your approximate time check for that? Or time estimate?
I still have probably 50 or 60 questions to go through. I would hope that I can get done in maybe 45 minutes. I'm hoping.
All right. I'm going to allow you to go forward. I don't think it should take that long, and let me tell you why. It's obviously how the facilities actually operate. BlueTriton has a much better understanding than anyone at the state board. I mean, no offense to Mr. Petrozelli and company, but it's BlueTriton's operation. So the only reason to ask Mr. Vasquez is if there's some reason that you want to explain about the level of his understanding of these facilities. It's not really to get in how the facilities actually operate. Is that correct?
It's how the board is interpreting the law and how BlueTriton facilities operate under that understanding.
Okay. All right. So Mr. Petrozelli, your hand's up again. Go ahead.
So I think by our estimate, BlueTriton had 10 minutes. That'll make their questioning solely of Mr. Vasquez, or on this part of the testimony, an hour and a half. That is far in excess, 100% in excess of the 45 minutes they are allotted as a party. All of the parties have equal rights. All the parties should have equal opportunities. We're all equal parties here. And I realize that, you know, they are the respondent, but so far we're at an hour and a half. That is double the allotted testimony time.
All right.
And we haven't even gotten to Mr. Eggers' testimony.
I understand. I said before, it's hearing officer discretion. I think Mr. Sanders has been trying to move forward efficiently. This is very important. BlueTriton is the only party on, I'll say, their side of these issues. I'm exercising my discretion to give him more than the 45 minutes. I am encouraging Mr. Sanders to move on promptly when these are just really questions about Mr. Vasquez's understanding. If there are matters that Mr. Eggers or Ms. Storks knows more about, I really am encouraging you to ask them so we can get done with this rather than trying to get Mr. Vasquez to speculate about things he does not know about. So with that, we're about ready to go forward, but I will call on Ms. Doty first. Go ahead. Your hand went down. All right, so Mr. Sanders, I'm going to give you 30 minutes. I think you ought to be able to get this done in that time. Please go ahead and proceed with your questioning. And as before, please ask my staff to put up copies of his pages from his testimony as you need to. So let's go forward.
Okay.
And I'm writing it down 3:37. So I really do expect you to be done by 4:10.
I will do my best, Mr. Lilly. Mr. Vasquez, your testimony at paragraph 21 states that
Okay.
the boreholes.
And let's put that up there. That's it's exhibit PT7, page 8, carrying on to page 9.
It's okay. I mean, Mr. Lilly, I'm okay with that, but it's I'm providing a place marker for where I'm questioning, but the question is relatively simple for him.
Okay, go ahead and ask it.
Yeah. Your testimony states that boreholes 1, 1A and 8, 7, 7A, 7B, 7C, and tunnels 2, 3, and 7 collect water subject to the water rights permitting authority of the State Water Board.
So go right there. Thank you, Ms. Moore. Go ahead.
And as the water is from natural springs, which would otherwise contribute to nearby springs. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is it correct that these natural springs are adjacent or in the immediate vicinity of tributary ravines of Strawberry Creek at the head of Coldwater Canyon?
That is correct.
Is
Objection, sorry, he misstated prior testimony. He said at the head of Coldwater Creek, and Mr. Vasquez testified earlier that they were at the head of Strawberry Creek, just to correct the record.
Yeah, it's confusing. Line 2 here does say tributary ravines of Strawberry Creek at the head of Coldwater Canyon. Mr. Vasquez, maybe you better clarify. These springs are actually at the headwaters of Strawberry Creek. Is that correct?
I'm actually confused now about these canyons, and I apologize for that. I would like to defer to Mr. Eggers.
Okay. So again, if Mr. Sanders, if you have a question regarding Strawberry Creek versus Coldwater Canyon, please ask Mr. Eggers
No,
those
I
questions.
don't, I'm just sort of laying the foundation for asking the question. Is your testimony that these collection facilities are subject to the state board's permitting jurisdiction because water collected is hydrologically connected to a spring?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question again?
Sure. Is your testimony that the BTB's collection facilities are subject to state board's permitting authority because the water collected is hydrologically connected to a spring?
No.
Well, can I, vague, because he's not saying which spring. There's many springs. So which ones are you specifically asking about?
Wait. Objection is overruled. Question has been answered. You may go ahead.
Perhaps Mr. Sanders could further specify what he means by hydrologically connected.
Okay, now that's a different objection. That was a little quickly. So maybe Mr. Sanders, you could clarify what you mean by hydrologically connected.
Well, that's a very good question. So, Mr. Vasquez, what does hydrologically connected mean?
That there's a connection hydrologically, but which two elements are you referring to that are
Between a
supposedly
spring
connected?
and a surface water body.
The spring and a surface water body?
And excuse me, Mr. Sanders, but I'm trying to help Mr. Vasquez here, but can you point in his testimony where he uses the term hydrologically connected?
I don't think it's there.
Hang on a second.
Because I otherwise it's you're sort of asking him to speculate, I think. I don't remember that term in his testimony, but it may be there somewhere.
You are correct that we don't use the term hydrologically connected. The term is water which would otherwise contribute to nearby streams.
So where are you reading from, just so we all know?
This is at the top of page 9, but it's part of paragraph 21.
Okay. And I'm going to just help us all out here so we don't have to scroll back down. But that sentence starts on the previous page, and it states, the report, and this is referring to the Dames and Moore report, includes a review of the history, geology, and construction details of the boreholes and tunnels, and documentation of, whoops, I was reading the wrong page. My bad. Try again. The bottom of page 8, paragraph 21 states, respondents' PODs from springs 1, 2, 3, 7, and 8 are diversions subject to the water rights permitting authority of the State Water Board, parentheses, Division 2 of the Water Code. And then it goes on to read what we can all see on the screen. So with that background, Mr. Sanders, please ask your question of Mr. Vasquez.
So is it your testimony that these collection facilities are subject to state board's permitting authority because the water, sorry, the water from natural springs is water that would otherwise contribute to
Again,
nearby
objection.
springs.
What is meant by collection facility?
I think, Mr. Sanders, the easiest way to do this is to ask him a specific question about his testimony. And Ms. Mullen, I don't know if is there any way you can scroll down so we can see the last two lines on the previous page and also this page? I don't know if it'll let you do that. Try it. No, it won't let you do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and scroll to page 9. And I think, Mr. Sanders, if you can just ask a question about the specific words, that may be able to address Mr. Petrozelli's objection.
I'm just trying to establish what the criteria are for the board's permitting jurisdiction. So,
okay, so why don't you just ask him that question? What are the criteria for the board's water right permitting jurisdiction that apply here?
Let's do that. What are the criteria for the board's permitting jurisdiction for BlueTriton?
So the advice or the legal advice that we got from the Office of Enforcement is a spring is part of the stream. And so in my oral testimony, there is a slide number 10 where I lay out the criteria and I talk about the criteria. And that is us as technical staff trying to interpret what we should see when what does a spring look like when it's tributary to a stream?
Can we put that on the screen, please?
Let's go to make it easier. Let's go to paragraph 31.
Okay, we'll go down to paragraph 31 of Exhibit PT7, which starts on page 12.
Correct.
Okay, so go ahead, Mr. Sanders, ask your question about this paragraph.
So to have permitting jurisdiction, do you need to meet the criteria that you listed in paragraph 31?
And again, I'm not clear.
Okay,
what criteria are you talking about in paragraph 31, just so our question is clear?
Whether the spring diversion is at the natural spring orifice, if there's a natural channel adjacent to the spring orifice such that the natural flows from the unmodified spring orifice would flow into or contribute to flow in the natural channel.
Okay, so why don't you split that up into parts so it's not a compound question, and ask Mr. Vasquez about the criteria that he is stating here are necessary for natural flow from a spring diversion to be within the permitting authority of the state board.
Is it is it any water that is hydrologically connected to the water that ultimately reaches a stream, is what you're saying is subject to the permitting jurisdiction of the board?
Objection, vague. His testimony says what it says in paragraph 31, I think is what he's asking about. And his present question is mischaracterizing his testimony. If he wants to ask him, is it his testimony? It's written right here in his written testimony. He can read it and say, is that your testimony? And Amanda Fry has had her hand up, forever. She must have something to say.
All right, so yeah, Ms. Fry, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand before. Oh, your hand just went down, I think.
Sorry.
Okay, so Mr. Sanders, here's the problem I have with this line of questioning. Mr. Vasquez, his testimony in paragraph 31 is pretty clear as to what he is saying his understanding is of the board's permitting authority. And beyond that, I think he has also testified that he got this understanding from the attorneys, and clearly these are legal questions. So I'm not sure what's the point of belaboring what his understanding might be beyond what is written here on this legal question that, he as an engineer has some knowledge but isn't fully qualified to answer.
Okay, I'll move on to a separate set of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Are the
Thank you.
criteria that you have listed in 31, are these criteria in statute?
Objection vague. Can Mr. Sanders specify which criteria he is asking about specifically in paragraph 31?
Objection is sustained. Why don't you ask it for each criteria one by one? It'll just end up going faster. Just ask, is each criteria listed in a statute?
And objection relevance, but just that his opinion of whether or not something is in the statute, I don't understand how that's relevant to whether or not it in fact is.
Well, I'm going to overrule that objection. I mean, he has put this into issue by offering this testimony about the board's jurisdiction. So Mr. Sanders is entitled to some questioning, although, clearly we're asking an engineer about, or he's asking an engineer about some pretty complex legal questions. But go ahead, Mr. Sanders, and if you can ask your questions, spell out the specific criteria you want to ask the question about, and then you can ask whether it's in a statute.
And Mr. Lilly, I want to echo Ms. Doty's objection. To the extent Mr. Sanders is asking for a legal conclusion, definitely object. What is perhaps more appropriate is Mr. Vasquez's understanding, in the sense that how he and his staff applied their understandings in the course of their investigation.
All right. Well, and I think that was what I said too. So, Mr. Sanders, really what we do want to get at here is what Mr. Vasquez's understanding of these requirements are and how he applied them, rather than details as to, the details of exactly what the actual legal criteria are. So I hope that gives you some guidance. Can you proceed with your questioning now?
Sure. So your testimony is that staff will first investigate whether the spring diversion is at a natural spring orifice. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Is that requirement anywhere in statute or regs?
That specific requirement to look for the spring orifice is not in statute or regs. I would qualify that there are statutes and regulations that mention springs.
Can you cite to those?
I believe in section 5,000 regarding statements, I believe regarding cannabis.
Do any of them address the permitting jurisdiction of the board over springs?
No. So what we were interpreting, or the criteria, is speaking to the legal advice that a spring is part of the stream. And probably broader, my general understanding that 1200 and 1201 would require a permit. So if I see a spring, or if I should see a spring that's flowing, that would be right for a question of, is this within our permitting authority?
So is your testimony that you have to see a flowing spring before you would have permitting jurisdiction?
No, what I just said right now is, if you see a spring, or if you should see a spring there, then that would be right for questioning whether or not a permit is required or not.
Okay. Maybe I could just do it the other way. are there criteria in statute or regs that that address permitting of spring water diversions?
I believe there might be a few regarding domestic use registrations about springs and how many registrations you can have at one spring, but domestic use registrations are, those are permits, or I think of them as similar to permits or licenses.
You rely on a need for the hydrologic connection, is that correct?
Objection, misstates testimony.
Yeah, I think Mr. Sanders, I'm going to sustain that objection. I don't think you've asked him about hydrologic connection, but we've determined that he doesn't actually use that term in his testimony, and I don't think he's ever stated anything about a hydrologic connection. So I think you're going to have to approach that line of questioning with different terminology. And Ms. Fry, your hand is up again. Did you want to say something here?
Yes, he keeps talking about statutes and regs and hydrological connection, but I think we need to be more specific. Are we talking federal, state? I mean, he's just done a broad sweep, and I'd like to have citations, please. Okay, well, the objection is overruled. He's entitled to ask Mr. Vasquez about his understanding of this, and Mr. Vasquez can clarify what types of statutes or regs his understanding is based on. So with that, Mr. Sanders, please go ahead.
Is it correct that your testimony says, is it correct that there is a need to have flow contribute to a natural channel for permitting jurisdiction?
Objection, what is meant by contribute?
Well,
I'm going to overrule the objection. Mr. Vasquez, is it your understanding that flow from a spring to a stream is necessary for the water board to have water right permitting jurisdiction?
That is correct. That the spring has to flow into the stream or contribute to the stream. I'm sorry.
And I'd further object that Mr. Sanders' question is also vague because it doesn't ask when the spring discharges flow to a stream.
Well, thank you. I'm going to sustain that objection, and our clarification, which Mr. Vasquez testified to earlier, is in a state of nature, it has to do that. So I think that was pretty clear. Obviously, if the entire spring flow is diverted, it no longer flows to the stream, but he has said that it's in a state of nature. If the flow from the spring is to a stream, then it's within the permitting jurisdiction. Do I have that right, Mr. Vasquez?
Yes, I'm referring to a natural unmodified spring orifice.
All right. So thank you. I hope, Mr. Petroselli, I think that addresses your objection.
Yes, I wanted to make sure we were clear on that.
All right. So thank you. Mr. Sanders, you may go ahead.
Of the springs that you indicate were obliterated, do you know the flow rate from any of those springs prior to construction of the water diversion facilities?
That information was not recorded according to the hydrological reports that were submitted to us by BlueTriton.
And earlier you testified that you didn't know exactly where all of the spring orifices were located, correct?
I don't think that was my testimony. When we read in the report that spring tunnel 2 was at a spring orifice, then we know that that's where the spring was.
Okay. For other than spring tunnels 2, 3, and 7, are those the only ones where you know where the orifices are?
I believe it can also be known where springs 1 and 8 are, because I believe the reports indicate that there are remnants of those still visible. But that's what, those reports were from the 90s. So I don't know the state now of the environment there now, if they are still visible, but those hydrology reports state that there were remnants.
So my question is, if you don't know exactly where the spring orifices are located or how much they flowed under natural conditions, can you definitively say that they flowed as far as a tributary, ravine, natural channel that you described?
Objection misstates prior testimony.
Prosecution team concurs with that objection.
I'm not sure. I think, Mr. Sanders, you better restate the question. I think that these objections may be the objections.
Mr. Vasquez, didn't you just testify you didn't know the exact location of all of the spring orifices?
Okay, and for that one, I'm definitely going to sustain the objection because he just testified that the report showed that he did believe that they could determine the historical locations for springs 2, 3, 7, 1, and 8.
Mr. Lilly, he did not testify as to 1 and 8. He said that they had some indication, but he did not know the exact location of those particular orifices.
Yeah, I wrote down remnants of these. So go ahead. Maybe I think it might be good if you restated your question in light of these objections.
Okay. So if maybe I'll phrase it a different way. Don't you, you need to know the exact location of the spring orifice and how much they flowed under natural conditions to say that they flowed as far as a tributary, ravine, natural, or a natural channel. Is that correct?
Objection calls for hypothetical.
I'm going to, this is a close call. I'm going to overrule the objection. Mr. Vasquez, answer if you have enough information to answer, and if you don't, state that you don't.
I could answer the question, but this is a question that's best answered by Ms. Stork.
All right, so I'm going to rule that I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Sanders, you can ask Ms. Stork this question if you want to, but don't follow up on this questioning with Mr. Vasquez.
Okay. Would a determination of how far water would flow across the ground surface be based on factors such as spring flow rates, soil type, and other data?
Objection, compound, and unclear whether he's continuing to ask Mr. Vasquez questions or if this is a question from the panel.
This is I'm
It's a
solely
hypothetical.
All right, so Mr. Sanders, I think your question would be better stated is what factors would Mr. Vasquez believe were important to investigate if he were determining, this is again in general, as I understand it, whether a spring is tributary to a stream, either in present condition or historical. Is that what you're getting at here?
And
yes.
And Mr. Lilly, Mr. Vasquez referred that question to Ms. Stork. Please let her answer that question.
Okay, I think that's
rather
a good
than interrupting
point.
the witnesses or the panel.
All right. So I'm gonna sustain that objection. Mr. Sanders, Ms. Stork is here. She's clearly more qualified, both from an engineering geologist point of view and from a factual investigation point of view, to answer this question. So you can ask her if you want, or you can move on.
Sure, I'll ask her. To determine how far water flows across the ground surface, should you base that decision on factors such as spring flow rates?
Objection calls for hypothetical.
I think it would be, I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Sanders, I think what you want to do is just ask Ms. Stork, what factors would she consider for such an investigation? Why don't you just ask her that?
And perhaps if Mr. Sanders wants, and I would also call that vague and further hypothetical, if he wants to ask about this investigation, then that may be more appropriate.
Okay, right now, my understanding is he wants to ask the question in general. Ms. Stork can answer the question in general and can provide whatever qualifications she believes are appropriate. So
Okay.
go ahead, Mr. Sanders.
What factors would you take into consideration to determine whether flow from a spring would reach a tributary ravine or a natural channel?
I would say that it's a site-specific determination based on a variety of information, some of which you spoke to earlier, which could be, not all, well, it could be the flow rate, could be the soil type, the slope of the area, but other things that you could take into account are historical information. And in this case, we also looked at historical documents that, and considering that these springs are in a very remote area, how else did they find them?
Did you or Mr. Vasquez take any field measurements or perform any calculations to determine that the spring orifices definitely flowed into tributary ravines or natural channels for any of the springs of BlueTriton?
When we were in the field, the spring orifices that we saw were obliterated for several of the springs. For springs 10, 11, and 12, there was no spring activity that we observed at the site, at the original spring orifices. And we did not see spring number 4. That was not on part of our tour.
Is your determination of whether the spring would generate flow to a tributary ravine or natural channel based on any technical standard or board guidance? Or any statute
Section
regulation?
vague.
I'm going to overrule. If she knows, she can answer.
Site-specific determination.
So the answer is no, there's no technical standard or board guidance?
You may answer that.
Guidance for what?
Right. I think she answered.
Excuse me, Ms. Stork has testified it's a site-specific determination. So, Mr. Sanders, what is your question at this point? She said it's site-specific.
But it's going to be, my question is, she responded that it's site-specific based on certain factors, but I'm wondering whether there's a methodology by which you make those determinations.
I said it was based on a variety of factors and didn't exclude any factors.
Understood. But my question is there a standard that you use to make that determination?
No, because it's a site-specific determination.
Okay.
Mr. Lilly, I believe the respondent has expended their remaining 30 minutes. They have far exceeded their allotted 45.
Yeah,
minutes.
we know. I know. I'm going to allow him to go ahead.
Can you indicate how long?
Mr. Sanders, how much longer do you think this is going to take?
I will do my best if we don't have interruptions.
Can Mr. Sanders indicate how long?
Excuse me, Mr. Petroselli. I'm going to ask the questions. Mr. Sanders, how much more time do you think you need to complete your examination of Mr. Vasquez and Ms. Stork as appropriate?
I hope that we can do it in under 30 minutes.
Okay, you really are starting to lose everyone's patience here. I think you're going into a lot of legal issues that these witnesses really are not qualified to answer. To the extent you're asking about board practice, board staff practice, I think those questions are relevant. So I'm going to encourage you to continue, but to focus on board practice and these witnesses' understandings of board practice rather than trying to ask them about esoteric legal questions that they really are not qualified to answer.
And Mr. Lilly, if asking about board practice, if Mr. Sanders could perhaps specify orders and decisions of the State Water Board as
Well,
board
he's,
practice.
when we talk about board practice, I think it's, unless he says otherwise, I'm assuming he means board staff practice, because I haven't seen any references to any board decisions or orders here. So,
Okay.
Mr. Sanders, go ahead. We really are,
Let's go.
this is
Let's
dragging
go.
on.
Understood. Can I bring up paragraph 69 of PT7?
Yes. And I'm going to help Ms. Mullen here. We're looking at page 20. She got there already, and she'll scroll down, I think, to paragraph 69. Okay, go ahead, ask your question.
And so you have this, it says based on extremely limited hydrogeologic data and known precipitation amounts. And then it goes on to say, you know, what various quantities. This is your testimony, correct?
This is for Mr. Vasquez now.
This is for Mr. Vasquez.
You have to go off mute too. You're still on mute. Try clicking again.
And Mr.
ahead.
Lilly,
There we go.
this is one paragraph of, you know, an entire written testimony. So it should be understood that to the extent we zero in on this one paragraph to the exclusion of the rest of the written testimony, it could put it out of context and mischaracterize the testimony of Mr. Vasquez.
And I think,
Wanna be
Mr.
careful.
Petrozelli, that's an appropriate thing for you to address on redirect when we get there. So I don't know whether that was an objection or not, but if it is, it's overruled. So go ahead, Mr. Sanders, please ask your question.
Okay,
about
is your
paragraphs.
testimony that 52% of the water is not within the permitting authority of the state board, is percolating groundwater, as you understand that term?
And then just to clarify, I'm going to help Mr. Petrozelli out here. This is in the reference of borehole 7, 7A, 7B, and 7C.
That's correct. Yes.
My testimony is that it may be water not within the permitting authority of the State Water Board, but it needs more information.
Didn't you testify this morning that this was percolating groundwater?
And excuse me, Mr. Sanders,
I'm going to object. Yeah.
I'm going to beat you to it, Ms. Murray. This is unclear at this point, so you're going to have to clarify. I don't know what this means. when
Okay.
you ask that.
With
And I think it
regard-
also mischaracterized previous testimony.
Okay, well, he's going to ask another question, so we'll see how that one goes.
With regard to the quantity diverted from borehole 7, 7A, 7B, and 7C, did you testify this morning that the 52% is percolating groundwater?
Objection mischaracterizes the testimony of the witness in that his testimony earlier was a summary of his written testimony.
I'm going to overrule that objection. I think this is a pretty good summary of what he said before, but he can certainly clarify if there was a misstatement of that testimony. Go ahead, Mr. Vasquez.
I would have, if you're saying that my statement was 52% was definitely percolating groundwater, then that is a misstatement, because I very clearly say in my written testimony that it may be water not within the permitting authority of the State Water Board. And that is also repeated in the report of the report of investigation. So if I misspoke, there's other, I think there's other evidence that what I should have said. But if you could look at the court recorders.
Understood.
Wait, Mr. Vasquez, we don't need to get into that. The testimony here pretty clearly says up to approximately 52% may be water not within the permitting authority of the State Water Board. So I think that's consistent with what you just said and what you said before. So Mr. Sanders, considering that statement here, what is your question?
The question was that consistent with what he testified to for his oral summary? It was different.
Asked and answered. Mr. Vasquez has recalled his oral summary to the best of his recollection already.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection, Mr. Sanders. If you think there's an inconsistency, you can point that out in your closing arguments.
For purposes of enforcement proceeding, specifically with regard to wells 7A, 7B, and 7C, when will the board make a determination as to the percentage of water within their jurisdiction?
And now, Mr. Sanders, I've told you before, and I'm going to tell you again, the board is confusing here.
You're right. You're right. You're right, Mr. Lillian. I apologize. When will the prosecution team determine that percentage?
Objection irrelevant because they're not seeking to enforce for that additional percentage.
I'm going to overrule that objection. Mr. Vasquez, if you can answer, go ahead. If you can't, then tell us you can't.
I believe I stated here in the written testimony and in my oral presentation that we seek a report as part of the cease and desist order to asking BlueTriton to more precisely define these percentages. And we state that the deputy director may then revise the findings, I believe, of the ROI based on that report.
Okay. Is developed water a legal classification like percolating groundwater or surface water?
Objection calls for legal conclusion.
And I'm going to overrule the objection, but with the understanding that Mr. Vasquez will testify as to his understanding of what the term, of whether the term developed water is a legal term or not.
And
so,
to the
Mr. Sanders,
extent-
why don't you restate the question that way?
And Mr. Lilly, to the extent that's in Mr. Vasquez's written testimony, I'd ask that we go to that part of Mr. Vasquez's written testimony. Mr. Sanders, can you direct us to that part of Mr. Vasquez's testimony?
I'm going to sustain that objection. That's valid. I believe he does talk about developed water. So, Mr. Sanders, if you want to ask him about developed water, it's only fair for him to have that part of his written testimony on the screen.
And as a geologist, I'd be happy to help with this as well.
And Ms. Stork, thank you. If Mr. Vasquez says that he can't answer the question in more detail, then we can. Mr. Sanders can follow up with you.
And Mr. Lilly, to the extent Mr. Sanders is asking about technical questions about geology and hydrogeology, Ms. Stork is the team's geologist.
Yes, and as I said before, you certainly will have the authority to call her as a rebuttal witness if you believe that's appropriate.
I just don't want us wasting time and belaboring points with Mr. Sanders asking the wrong witness.
I understand.
The wrong witness.
And that's why I want Mr. Sanders to point to the part of Mr. Vasquez's written testimony where he used the term developed water, so Mr. Sanders can ask him about his use of that term, because then the question will be focused on Mr. Vasquez's testimony.
Paragraph 73.
Okay, so that's helpful. This is on page 21, 73. And if you can, Ms. Mullen, just scroll down a little bit more if you can. Here we are, developed water. Okay, so ask your question about the specific part of this paragraph that you want to ask about.
You use the term, what's your understanding of the term developed water?
Objection.
Okay, and just so we're clear, this testimony uses the words developed water on line 14. So, Mr. Vasquez, the question is, what did you mean by the term developed water when you put it in this part of your written testimony?
Oh, it's any increase over the natural flow. Or in this case of spring 7, since we do not have natural flow, as we explained on the ROI, we take the flow that would come out of spring tunnel 7 as base flow.
Okay.
Is there a legal definition for that term?
I'm sorry,
again,
Calls for
for base
legal
flow or?
conclusion.
For developed water?
Objection calls for a legal
Objection.
conclusion.
It does not call for a legal.
Let's let Mr.
conclusion.
Lilly rule on that.
Excuse me, everybody. Thank you. I still am trying to preside here. Mr. Vasquez, you may answer that question to the extent you have an understanding of whether there's a legal, excuse me, Mr. Sanders, was the question, is there a legal term for developed
Is
water?
there a legal definition for developed water?
Okay, so Mr. Vasquez, if you have an understanding of whether or not there's a legal definition of the term developed water, you may state that. If you don't have an understanding, say, I don't have an understanding of that.
I don't have an understanding of that.
All right. Mr. Sanders, you may
Okay.
proceed.
Trying to, like I said, go as quickly as I can.
Yep, I understand. There have been some interruptions here.
On paragraph 85 of your testimony.
Okay, let's move to paragraph 85. That's on page 23. We'll scroll down there. Okay, right. Whoops. There we go. All right, go ahead.
You have testimony that in the middle there that says, additionally, any developed flow from boreholes 1 and 8 may have otherwise surfaced. And then, therefore, they're presumptively in the board's authority. So is this your testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Please explain how it is that not all spring water is subject to the state board's jurisdiction under this scenario.
Wait, I'm sorry, Mr. Sanders, but I before other parties object, I'm going to basically ask you to rephrase that question because I don't think that's what this states here. I think you're going to have to more closely track what this states with your question to Mr. Vasquez.
Okay. If the way this is, well, you talk about if developed water may have otherwise surfaced elsewhere. Is that water, if it surfaces elsewhere, subject to the water board's jurisdiction under its permitting authority?
I can attempt. I would like to defer to Ms. Stork about this question.
Please.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Sanders, do you want to ask Ms. Stork this question?
This testimony, well, one, it's Mr. Vasquez's testimony, but if there is developed water.
Can Mr. Sanders direct us to the portion or relevant portions of Mr. Vasquez's testimony that he is asking Ms. Stork about?
He's trying to ask about paragraph 85. So Mr. Sanders, which is up on the screen. So do you want to ask, Mr. Sanders, do you want to ask Ms. Stork a question about developed water?
You indicate that that the testimony says that any developed flow from boreholes 1 and 8 may have otherwise surfaced at other springs is subject to the board's jurisdiction, or is that water subject to the board's jurisdiction? If it
let's try to get through this.
I understand.
Let's try to get through this. Ms. Stork, maybe you can just explain, first of all, whether you have anything further to say about these two sentences, and then if you can give an explanation of the extent of the Water Board's water right permitting authority, we might be able to get through this pretty quickly.
And can
So
we
go
again
ahead.
specify which two sentences, Mr.
Yes,
Lilly?
it's the last two sentences of paragraph 85, I think, are the ones we're talking about. And I'll just read them. And then Ms. Stork, so the two sentences read, additionally, any developed flow from boreholes 1 and 8 may have otherwise surfaced at other springs up gradient or down gradient. Therefore, all flows from boreholes 1 and 7 are presumptively subject to the board's water right permitting authority. So, Ms. Stork, I think the question is, could you explain why all flows from boreholes 1 and 8 would be presumptively subject to the board's water right permitting authority?
Yes, my understanding from working with my attorneys when working on this case is that there's case law and or previous board decisions. I can't remember the exact ones because it's been a while since I moved on from Division of Water Rights Enforcement, but my understanding is that there is case law and or board decisions that state that if developed water would have surfaced elsewhere in the watershed and contributed to the natural flow of a stream, then it is subject to the permitting authority of the State Water Board, hence Victor's testimony here on lines 22 and 21 and 22, or 22 and 23.
It's lines 20 through 22 and a half, basically.
Thank you.
All right, that's their understanding. Mr. Sanders, would you like to move on?
So is it Mr. Vasquez, is it your testimony that the borehole 1A is subject to the board's permitting authority because when borehole 8 is shut in, water may instead flow to the surface from borehole 1A?
And it would be good, Mr. Sanders, if I don't see borehole 1A being referenced here, can we go to the paragraph where it's
paragraph 90? Sorry, my apologies, Mr. Lilly.
Yeah, let's scroll down to 90. Okay, so now if you can ask your question again, sorry.
Is it your testimony that borehole 1A is subject to the state board's permitting authority because when borehole 8 is shut in, water may instead flow to the surface from borehole 1A?
All right, that's for Mr. Vasquez.
That is.
Again, I would like to defer to Ms. Stork, who did this analysis that's captured in this statement, in this paragraph.
All right, so Mr. Sanders, you may ask Ms. Stork this question. Please go,
Sure.
Maybe you should just restate it because
I'll
I don't want to
restate
misstate it.
It's not Ms. Stork's testimony, but is it your understanding that borehole 1A is subject to the board's permitting authority because when borehole 8 is shut in, water may instead flow to the surface from borehole 1A?
I honestly would need to review my notes and the sequence of events that gets us from original borehole 1 all the way to all the way to 1A. Would you like me to review my notes?
Sure, please review your notes.
All right, I may need up to 5 minutes because it's a complex sequence of events that gets from borehole 1 through the next borehole 1 to 1A, et cetera. So I may need to refer to the hydrodynamics report as well as my own report of investigation.
Okay, not to put you on the spot too much, Ms. Stork, but we'll take a break I would like to try to wrap up this cross-ex today if we can. We do have a hard cutoff at 5 o'clock.
Yes,
But
Mr. Lilly, thank you for remembering.
I certainly am sympathetic to people with childcare obligations. I used to have them. But let's just take a short break till 4:35, and then we will come back. Everyone can, whatever you do, don't log off, but you can turn off microphone and camera.
Can we get the testimony back on screen? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mullen. Okay, I'm back, but I'm waiting for others to get back here.
Mr. Lilly, when we're back, can we be sure to read back the question so we know where we're starting from?
We will definitely read back the question.
Thank you.
We have to get Ms. Stork and Mr. Sanders back first, though.
I'm here.
Oh, there's Ms. Stork. So we just need Mr. Sanders and we'll get going.
My apologies.
Okay,
Mr.
there's
Lilly.
Mr. Sanders. All right. So Ms. Stork, have you had an opportunity to review your notes about borehole 1A?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So Mr. Sanders, could you please repeat your question regarding borehole 1A and we'll go from there.
Sure. Is it the position of the prosecution team that borehole 1A is subject to state board's permitting authority because when borehole 8 is shut in, water may instead flow to the surface from borehole 1A?
That's part of it. Oh, sorry.
Wait. I just got a notice that our recording has stopped here. This is serious. So hang on just a minute here. And let me make sure that we get our recording back on. I'm not sure what the problem is. I'm going to just ask Mr. Woolridge, you sent me the text that our recording isn't going to. Can we start yet or do we still have a problem? You'll have to go off mute. Tell me what's going on here.
It looks like we've started again. We just weren't started, so might want to start everything from after the break over again.
All right. So we can thank you for letting me know. So just very quickly during the break, Ms. Stork had a chance to review her notes about borehole 1A, and Mr. Sanders was going to ask her, or did ask a question about the prosecution team's position regarding borehole 1A. So sorry to impose on you, Mr. Sanders, but please ask your question one more time so it is on the record.
No
And
worries.
Mr. Lilly, I think when we took our break, Mr. Sanders had approximately 5 minutes left of his
All right, well, we've
several
had enough.
extensions that were given, and we're getting very close to our 5 p.m. hard cut.
And we may have to go over until tomorrow. I'm going to give him a chance to complete his questioning, even if it takes until tomorrow. I'm just going to tell you that now. So, Mr. Sanders, please ask your question to Ms. Stork, and let's keep going.
Sure. Is it the testimony of the prosecution team that borehole 1A is subject to the state board's permitting authority because when borehole 8 is shut in, water may instead flow to the surface from borehole 1A?
So that's part of it. My understanding of the history of this particular borehole and spring is that spring 1 was originally developed by installing a boring and obliterating the original spring orifice. Eventually, it was redeveloped by installing a second boring to intercept it. The original boring, presumably because some sort of clogging, that was the statement of practice. If it clogged, you drill a new one at an angle to intercept the first one. And that 1A is very close, so close that on the Dames and Moore map, it is not distinguished from 1. So in addition, we know that there used to be flow at the spring upgradient in number 1 here, the POD for license 1649. There's no longer flow there, or in the case of some Forest Service reports, there's very tiny amounts of flow possibly. And also we know there is spring 4 directly down gradient. So any developed water from this spring, from this boring, very likely may have contributed to either building up the water table such that license 1649, that POD would flow, and it's very likely contributes to spring 4. And so in part, it's because of that shut-in test demonstrating the hydrological connection, but also it has to do with proximity and other factors and other evidence.
Can you cite to the data or technical evidence for that position?
Yes. Let's go through this. So spring POD for license 1649 being dewatered, where would you like me to start?
Well, maybe I should ask, does the testimony cite any third-party analysis? Mr. Vasquez?
I believe it cites my report. That's actually straight from my report, and the citations right here, it cites a few different things.
And what evidence do you have that development of 1A caused dewatering of the spring point of diversion for license 1649?
We know that 1649 used to flow at a certain flow rate, and it is no longer flowing at that flow rate. At the same time, there was further development continuously at the site.
Do all springs have a constant flow?
No.
So it's possible that there are other reasons for that change in flow of from the point of diversion for license 1649?
It's possible, but given all the information we have, it's reasonable to investigate or to think there's a good likelihood of some sort of connection.
And what exactly does dewatering mean?
It means that the flow decreases from the spring.
Does it completely stop?
It varies from year to year, from season to season. You would have to look at the data from the Forest Service spring site.
So dewatering doesn't mean it goes to zero. Is that what you're saying? Sorry, just understand.
Dewatering is a general term, meaning there's less water.
Okay. I want to put up paragraph 90. I think this is still here. I want Mr. Vasquez to describe, and part of my struggle with these questions, and I apologize, is an understanding. So Mr. Vasquez, please describe exactly what paragraph 90 means.
I'm gonna not allow that question.
Vague.
That's too general of a question. You have to be more specific, Mr. Sanders.
Well,
And Mr. Lilly, we're way past the extended time and we're very close to 5 o'clock. Mr. Sanders is, belaboring his points. I really ask that we, wrap this up very expeditiously.
Well, I'll decide that. Mr. Sanders, do you have a specific question rather than that very general question?
It's tough, Mr. Lilly. We'll move on. That's okay.
Okay. I think this is for closing.
Okay. Mr. Vasquez, in paragraph 97 of your testimony.
I'm going to go to that. It's on the next page. 97, Mr. Mullen, if you can scroll down, please. What is your question?
So you testified that you lack information that boreholes 10, 11, and 12 dewater or affect the natural flow of a natural spring. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's what I testified to.
And you also testified that you lack information that the springs that could be affected by boreholes 10, 11, and 12 are contributing to flow in a natural channel. Is that correct?
I believe I say, I'm not sure if it's in this paragraph, if we could scroll down to the continuation.
Well, wait, I think this is a pretty simple question. This is the sentence says, we also lack information that springs that could be affected by boreholes 10, 11, and 12 are contributing to the flow in a natural channel. I mean, Mr. Sanders, I think you basically asked him, did he say that sentence, which he clearly did. So I think you can go on to your follow-up question.
And then in you testified, and this is a different paragraph, but it should be a relatively simple one, that boreholes 10, 11, and 12 are in or adjacent to a meadow and not adjacent to a watercourse or tributary ravine. Is that correct? And this is
vague. Which paragraph are you now?
92.
So let's scroll up. I think that's what 92 says. What is your question, Mr. Sanders, about 92?
I'm just clarifying that the board is claiming that they have no jurisdiction over 10, 11, and 12.
Okay, and again, it's not the board, it's the prosecution team, but
prosecution team.
I mean, their position is stated in their testimony. What more do you want Mr. Vasquez to say about this?
The problem is, well, let me just ask a couple of questions then. In your draft cease and desist order, you mandate that the user provide additional investigation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what's the basis of authority for the board to require a user of percolating groundwater to prepare and submit a report more precisely quantifying the amount of flow that would have surfaced naturally at a spring?
Objection. Calls for a legal conclusion.
I'm
going to overrule the objection. Mr. Vasquez has testified to a draft CDO. It certainly is appropriate for Mr. Sanders to ask him if he knows the basis of the legal authority. If he does not, he can simply say, my attorney is going to have to answer that question and we'll defer to the attorney.
Then may we put the portion of the draft CDO that orders that compliance action on the screen?
Do we need to do that, Mr. Sanders, or is that your only question about the CDO, draft CDO?
What is the authority? So no, it doesn't need to be up on. So I'm asking a question is what authority does the board have to require this?
My
For a
understanding,
legal conclusion.
All right. I've overruled that objection. Please state your understanding, Mr. Vasquez.
my understanding and what the draft CDO says is it's pursuant to Water Code 1051, I believe.
Okay, I think beyond that, Mr. Sanders, this is a legal question for briefing.
That's fine.
I really was trying to wrap things up today. Ms. Doe, wait, stop.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Apologies.
I was just gonna say, Ms. Doe, you've had your hand up. I'm really trying to wrap this up today, but if you have something you have to say, go ahead.
No, my hand is not up anymore. I apologize.
Okay, try to take it down then. All right, go ahead, Mr. Sanders.
When would the board determine whether BTB's collections at boreholes 10, 11, and 12 are within the board's permitting authority?
And again, I assume you mean when would the PT make this determination? Is that right?
I apologize, Mr. Lilly, you're correct.
Mr. Vasquez, can you answer that question?
When will the board make a determination as to another percentage?
When will is there any plan proceeding for the PT to determine whether any of the water at that's extracted by boreholes 10 and 11 is subject to the board's permitting authority?
The draft CDO directives state the plan.
Okay, that's fine. You can just leave it at that. Mr. Sanders, that's, I think, his answer.
Okay. Mr. Lilly, do you mind if I have just literally 2 minutes to confer with my colleagues to see whether we're done or not?
Yes, please take your 2 minutes. You can go on mute if you want. And we are going to try to wrap up this line of questioning today if we can. All right, Mr. Sanders, are you back? Go ahead.
I am back. We have concluded the cross-examination of Mr. Vasquez. Mr. Vasquez,
All right, thank you. And Mr. Vasquez and Ms. Stork, thank you for your testimony today. We appreciate that. We will stop today. We will start tomorrow morning with BlueTriton's cross-examination of Mr. Eggers, and we'll go forward from there. I do admonish the BlueTriton attorneys. I think you can see from our process that this can be made more efficient by asking specific questions about the witness's testimony. If you have the citations, that makes it go a lot faster. And particularly for legal issues, it's really most effective to ask about the witness's understanding about those legal issues, because as engineers in this field, they have some understandings, but certainly don't have the detailed understanding that one would expect from a lawyer. So is there anything else we need to cover today, or can we wrap up?
I have one quick procedural question, if I might.
Go ahead, Ms. Dooley.
So will tomorrow, following BlueTriton's cross, will the other parties then cross, or will there be a redirect in between each party's cross? And
No, we'll go straight to all other parties questioning, my questions, and then we'll go back to the prosecution team redirect at the end.
Right, thank you.
That's our plan. We will be back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you all for a productive day. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly.
Thank you.
Thank you.